He was homeless and bought an abandoned shack for just one. But behind the fireplace, he found a secret worth 50 million. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The city was never kind to men who had lost their place in it. He had once walked these same streets in clean boots and with the purposeful stride of a man who had a paycheck waiting for him on Friday, a wife at home with warm supper on the stove, and the certainty that tomorrow would look much the same as today. Now his steps were slow and heavy, as if each one was weighed down by stones hidden in his pockets. The years had stripped him bare, layer by layer, until nothing remained but a man with no address, no steady meals, and no one who still called his name with affection. His hair, once thick and dark, was threaded through with silver, and his face, lined with exhaustion, told the story of sleepless nights on benches and the sharp wind gnawing at his skin through thin coats. There was a time when he had been proud of his calloused hands, the kind that proved he could build, repair, and provide. Construction had been his trade. He had worked with bricks, steel, and timber, shaping homes where other families laughed and grew old. He remembered the smell of fresh-cut wood, the satisfaction of a wall raised straight and true, the camaraderie of co-workers who knew the worth of sweat. All of it was gone now, replaced by hunger gnawing at his stomach and shame gnawing at his heart. The recession had come like a tidal wave, swallowing contracts, laying off men by the hundreds, and leaving behind streets littered with the broken ambitions of workers like him. At first he had believed it would pass. He had polished his boots, put on a pressed shirt, and knocked on doors of offices that used to know his name. But weeks stretched into months, savings shrank to nothing, and the letters with red stamps began to arrive, each one another nail in the coffin of his old life. The final blow had not been the job loss, nor even the foreclosure that forced him from the house where he had once hung photographs on the walls. It had been the day his wife, exhausted from his anger and silence, signed the divorce papers. She had left him with little more than the clothes he owned and the memory of their daughter's laughter echoing in rooms that were no longer his. He had watched them drive away, a box of belongings in the trunk, and he had known with bone-deep certainty that he had failed. From that moment on, each step was not just about survival, but about carrying the unbearable weight of his mistakes. Nights on the street turned into months of drifting. He had slept in church basements, under bridges, in shelters where the smell of sweat and desperation clung to the walls. He had stood in lines for soup with men who stared at the ground, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes, as though shame was contagious. Sometimes he collected cans. Sometimes he took day labor when his body would allow it. But more often than not, he wandered, existing rather than living. His most precious possession was an old rucksack with a broken zipper, inside which he kept a single photograph of his daughter when she was 6 years old. In the picture, she wore a birthday crown cut from cardboard, her smile wide enough to brighten the whole frame. He would take it out in the darkest hours, looking at it until the edges blurred with tears he never let fall in public. The city itself seemed to mock him. Neon lights cast garish reflections on puddles. Billboards shouted promises of luxury cars and vacations he could never afford, and the passers-by gave him a wide berth, as if his misfortune might stain them. He often caught his reflection in store windows, gaunt, shoulders hunched, beard uneven, and failed to recognize the man staring back. Once he had believed in the dignity of honest work, the value of perseverance, and the fairness of life. Now all he believed in was the next corner where he might find shelter from the wind. On a morning like so many others, gray and cold, he scavenged near a diner's back alley, hoping for leftovers. Instead, his eyes fell on something lying half-buried under a soggy cardboard box. An old folded newspaper, its edges damp and curling. He almost ignored it, but hunger and habit made him pick it up, scanning for discarded coupons. The pages smelled of ink and mildew, headlines long since irrelevant. But then, tucked between farm equipment ads and the notice of a lost dog, he saw it, a small box of text so brief he almost skipped it. Mountain cabin, Cedar Ridge area, 1930s build, stone foundation, 1 cash, no inspections. Final sale. He blinked, certain he was misreading. $1? Not 1,000, not 10,000. A single solitary dollar. His first thought was that it had to be a joke, perhaps a cruel one placed there by someone who enjoyed baiting the desperate. But the words were printed as clearly as the rest, accompanied by a phone number that looked too ordinary to be a trick. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat, his mind spinning in ways it hadn't for years. That evening, sitting in the corner of a shelter, he unfolded the newspaper again and read the ad until the words imprinted themselves in his mind. He couldn't explain why it gnawed at him so relentlessly. The rational part of him said it was ridiculous. $1 could barely buy stale bread at the corner store, yet here it promised a cabin, an actual building in the mountains. Still, there was another part of him, the part that had not been completely smothered by despair, that whispered it might be real. That whisper was dangerous because it sounded like hope. The following days were marked by indecision. He carried the newspaper with him, smoothing its wrinkles each time he pulled it from his pocket. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, a mirage meant to tempt fools. Yet he found himself searching his pockets for coins, counting the meager change that rattled at the bottom of his rucksack. Each time, he came up short, but he scavenged more deliberately, collecting cans and bottles, pushing himself to take any odd job. When at last he held a single crumpled dollar bill in his hand, he stared at it for a long time, knowing how absurd it was to trade his last security for what might be nothing. The payphone on the corner swallowed the coin reluctantly, the static on the line stretching the silence until he thought no one would answer. Then after 6 rings, a gravelly voice came. He forced the words out, his throat dry. "I'm calling about the cabin in the paper." There was silence so long he thought the call had dropped. Finally, the voice rasped, "You got cash?" He swallowed. "Yes, $1. Another pause, then, "Be in Cedar Ridge tomorrow by noon. Ask for Martha Henderson. She'll have the paperwork." And the line went dead. He stood holding the receiver, the dial tone buzzing like a hornet in his ear, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He had no idea if he had just agreed to the smartest decision of his life or the most foolish. As he replaced the receiver, he caught sight of himself in the scratched glass of the phone booth. For the first time in years, his reflection didn't look entirely like a stranger. There was something flickering behind his eyes, a spark he thought long extinguished. The rest of that night passed in restless anticipation. He barely slept on the shelter cot, tossing and turning as if the cabin itself was calling him. Memories of his old life rose unbidden. His daughter's drawing of a house with a chimney, the way his wife used to bake bread on Sundays, the pride he once felt standing in front of something he had built. Could $1 really buy him a chance to rebuild even a fragment of that? Or was it a cruel illusion, one final test by a world that had already stripped him bare? He had no answers, only the decision to try. Morning came, and with it, the weary routine of a man with nothing left but the strength to walk forward. Yet this morning felt different. The folded newspaper in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, and the dollar bill hidden in his wallet weighed more than gold. He boarded a bus bound for the mountains, the engine groaning as it pulled away from the city. The buildings receded, replaced by stretches of open road and glimpses of pine ridges on the horizon. With each mile, the noise of the city fell behind, and a strange quiet filled the space it left. He pressed his forehead against the window, watching the changing scenery blur past. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering that he was a fool, that no miracle would come from $1 spent on a ghost of a house. But beneath the doubt was something steadier, something he had almost forgotten how to feel. It was the faintest hum of possibility, the fragile hope that perhaps life was not entirely finished with him yet. By the time the bus rolled into the small town that marked the edge of Cedar Ridge, the man who stepped off was not the same one who had scavenged a newspaper from an alley. His clothes were still threadbare, his boots worn, his shoulders heavy with years of failure. But his eyes searched the road ahead with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He did not know it yet, but the path he had just set foot upon would lead him into a mystery buried for nearly a century, into secrets hidden behind stone walls, and into a legacy that would demand of him more than he thought he had left to give. And so, with nothing but a crumpled dollar and a heart that dared to hope once more, he began the journey toward the cabin that everyone else had long since abandoned. The road out of town was little more than a cracked ribbon winding into the mountains, a line of faded asphalt that seemed to climb into another world. He carried nothing but his rucksack and the folded newspaper that had become a talisman, the ink already smudged from his constant handling. The bus driver had let him off at a crossroads where the pavement gave way to gravel and told him, almost with pity, that Cedar Ridge was still another few miles up the slope. He walked the rest of the way, the crunch of stones beneath his boots reminding him with each step how far he had come from the city streets where he had been invisible. The air grew sharper, fresher, carrying the resinous scent of pine. It felt like he was shedding something with every mile, though whether it was despair or merely the last illusions of his old life, he could not say. Cedar Ridge was less a town than a scattering of buildings clinging to the roadside. A gas station with a single pump leaned against a weathered diner with a sign whose letters had long since surrendered to rust. Across the road stood a blue house with a crooked fence that the bus driver had said belonged to a woman named Martha Henderson. He paused for a long moment, uncertain, staring at the little cluster of structures as if they might reject him. The weight of the dollar bill in his wallet seemed suddenly absurd. What could a man like him possibly gain here except another humiliation? Yet the memory of the phone call pressed him forward. He pushed open the door of the diner, the bell above it jangling with a sound that carried through the quiet room. Heads turned, a handful of locals seated at cracked vinyl booths, their eyes assessing him with the weary suspicion of people who had seen too many drifters pass through. He ordered a coffee with the last of his coins, the waitress setting down a chipped mug without a word. When he asked for directions to the Henderson place, the man at the counter beside him chuckled bitterly. "So you're the fool who bought the dollar cabin." The words were not cruel so much as resigned, as if the title of fool was simply another part of the transaction. He felt a flicker of defensiveness rise in him, but instead of bristling, he found himself answering with quiet steadiness. "Yes, that's me." The man shook his head slowly, like someone who had seen this story play out before and knew the ending. He muttered something about bad luck clinging to old stones, but then pointed up the dirt road that vanished into the trees. "Blue house with the crooked fence," he said, echoing the driver. "But if I were you, I'd turn around while you still can." The words lodged in his mind, unsettling, but not enough to sway him. He finished the bitter coffee, left a few coins on the counter, and walked back into the thin mountain sunlight. The Henderson house looked as tired as everything else in Cedar Ridge. The fence sagged like it was weary of standing, the paint flaking in strips that revealed older coats beneath. When he knocked, the door opened slowly to reveal a woman in her 70s, silver hair pulled into a bun, her sharp eyes softened by the kind of wisdom that comes only from decades of watching people arrive and leave. She studied him for a long moment, not unkindly, and then said, "You must be here for the cabin." Her voice carried no surprise. It was as if she had been expecting him for years. She ushered him inside and he found himself at a kitchen table cluttered with papers. The deed lay among them, handwritten on paper so thick it felt more like cloth than pulp, the letters looping with the kind of care that had gone out of fashion generations ago. The legal description was written in terms of boundary stones, creek beds, and old landmarks that may not have survived. She laid a rusty key on the table, its weight disproportionate to its size, and slid the documents toward him. He hesitated before signing, the absurdity of it all pressing down on him. A single dollar for a piece of land, a cabin with history longer than his own failures. Yet when he pressed his name onto the page with the dull pen she provided, he felt as though he had tethered himself to something more permanent than he had known in years. "Why $1?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She regarded him with an expression that seemed to measure the weight of his soul. "Because that's what Samuel Whitmore would have wanted," she said softly. The name struck him with unfamiliarity, but the way she spoke, it carried reverence. "He built that cabin. He didn't care much for money, only for doing what was right. Most folks around here think you're either very brave or very foolish to take it on." She handed him a tin of cookies decorated with faded flowers, and for a moment the gesture pierced his shell of weariness. "What do you think?" she asked. He stared at the key, at the documents, at the faint steam rising from the coffee she had poured him. He wanted to say he thought he was foolish, because that was the safer answer. But another voice whispered inside him, the same one that had made him dial the number in the first place. "I think I need to find out," he said finally. Her eyes softened, though the sadness did not leave them. "Then you best honor the place," she told him. "It's been empty a long time, but not forgotten." When he stepped back outside with the key in his pocket and the papers tucked into his rucksack, he felt the shift of something monumental. The road that led to the cabin twisted upward through the trees, the afternoon sun breaking through in fragments like scattered coins of gold. The locals' warnings rang in his ears, but so did the memory of Martha Henderson's voice, carrying both caution and hope. Each step took him deeper into the forest, the sound of the creek nearby, the call of hawks overhead. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man merely drifting. He felt like a man moving towards something, even if he did not yet understand what. The climb was long, the shadows lengthening as he pushed forward, but the anticipation kept his legs steady. His breath rose in white plumes as evening approached, and with every turn of the road he half expected the cabin to appear, yet it remained hidden. Finally, just as doubt threatened to creep back into his mind, the trees parted and he caught sight of stone rising out of the earth, weathered but proud. His pace quickened. The cabin waited. The place they had called worthless, cursed, and forgotten stood in the clearing like a sentinel of time. And the man who had spent years with nothing felt a strange stirring in his chest, as though he were about to reclaim something lost long before he had ever arrived. He tightened his grip on the rucksack, the rusty key heavy in his pocket, and stepped into the clearing. The dollar cabin, his cabin now, loomed before him with all the weight of 90 years of silence. He did not know yet whether he had walked into salvation or into ruin. All he knew was that the journey had begun. The clearing was quiet, save for the low murmur of the creek winding along the edge of the property and the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. He stood at the edge of it for a long moment, almost afraid to step closer, as though the cabin might dissolve into smoke if he approached too quickly. After the long climb from town, with Martha Henderson's words still echoing in his memory, the sight of the cabin felt at once unreal and inevitable, as though he had been walking toward this place not for hours, but for years. The structure looked tired, but there was a strange dignity in its posture. The stone walls, though furred with moss on their northern faces, rose straight and unwavering. The roof sagged where beams had surrendered to time, and one of the shutters hung at a broken angle, creaking faintly whenever the wind shifted. Yet despite these wounds, the cabin seemed alive, not abandoned, but merely waiting. The air carried the scent of old wood, damp earth, and the faint resin of pine pitch baked into its stones by decades of seasons. He felt a chill at the base of his neck, the uncanny sense that the place was aware of him, measuring him in silence, deciding whether he belonged. He walked slowly around the cabin, each step revealing more details. The porch sagged in the middle, boards bleached gray and splintering beneath his boots. Weeds pushed up through the gaps, reclaiming the space inch by inch. A nest of twigs jutted from the crooked chimney, evidence of birds that had long ago claimed it as their own. The windows were veiled with dust, their glass fractured by spiderweb cracks that refracted the failing light into ghostly patterns. And yet, here and there, he saw signs of care stones fitted with precision, corners joined as though the builder had intended this place to outlast him. The key weighed heavily in his pocket as he reached the front door. The lock resisted at first, groaning with disuse, but with a final twist it surrendered, and the door creaked open on rusted hinges. The smell met him at once: dust, stale wood, and the faint mineral tang of stone. He stepped inside cautiously, his boots thudding on wide planks worn smooth with age. The cabin was one great room, the heart of which was a fireplace so massive it seemed almost to have grown from the earth itself. The mantle was a single beam, thick and scarred but solid, and the hearth yawned wide enough to swallow logs the size of telephone poles. Light filtered through the grimy windows in muted shafts, illuminating the air where motes of dust floated like tiny stars. His breath sounded too loud, echoing faintly as if the cabin itself were listening. He let his rucksack slide to the floor and walked the perimeter, fingertips trailing over the rough plaster and exposed beams. Every corner held traces of another life, A cracked ceramic jug on a shelf, a rusted kettle abandoned beside the cold hearth, scraps of fabric clinging stubbornly to a chair frame whose legs had long since given up. He felt like an intruder in a museum, stepping through someone else's memory. Exhaustion tugged at him, yet curiosity pressed harder. He opened the back door, surprised at the view it revealed. Beyond the threshold, the land opened into a wide sweep of meadow, the mountains rising in jagged grandeur beyond. The peaks caught the last fire of the setting sun, their snow caps burning with hues of rose and gold. And for a moment he forgot the hunger in his belly and the ache in his legs. He had spent months looking at concrete walls, neon signs, and the indifferent faces of strangers. Now the world had stretched out before him again, vast and unashamed, and he felt the faintest thread of belonging tugging at him. When he returned inside, his eyes fell once more on the fireplace. Something about its stones unsettled him, the way certain blocks were too perfectly fitted, as though chosen not just for function, but for meaning. He crouched beside it, running his fingers over the mortar lines. One stone in particular caught his attention. A smooth, rectangular block, unlike the rougher rocks around it. Its edges were precise, its surface almost polished, and when he pressed against it, he felt the faintest give. His pulse quickened. With cautious effort, he worked it free, the stone sliding out of place with a sound that made the silence of the cabin seem to hold its breath. Behind it lay a cavity, dark and dry. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against something wrapped in brittle cloth. Carefully, he drew it out and laid it on the floor. The bundle was small, tied with string that crumbled at his touch. He unwrapped it, the cloth falling away to reveal several folded sheets of paper, yellowed with age but still intact. On the topmost sheet, written in faded ink, were the words, "Cabin Plans, S. Whitmore, 1937. His mouth went dry. The pages were not merely sketches, but detailed blueprints, the lines precise and annotated in a careful hand. They showed the cabin as it stood around him, each wall and beam marked with measurements. But there was more. The plans revealed structures he had not seen outside. An outbuilding near the tree line, a root cellar marked with curious notations, and most astonishing of all, underground chambers linked to the cabin by narrow passages. He traced the lines with trembling fingers, struggling to comprehend. For a long time he sat on the floor before the fireless hearth, the blueprints spread around him like relics of a forgotten age. He felt as though the builder, this mysterious Samuel Whitmore, were reaching across nearly a century to place a secret in his hands. Questions swirled in his mind. Who had Whitmore been? Why had he hidden these papers instead of leaving them in plain sight? And why, of all places, had he marked the words, "For the Children, 1938, beneath his signature? The words made something ache inside him, stirring memories of his own daughter, the one whose photograph he kept folded in his rucksack. For the children. What children had lived here? And why had they needed hidden rooms beneath the earth? The light in the cabin dimmed as night gathered outside. He lit a small fire in the hearth, half expecting the chimney to choke with years of debris. But to his surprise, the smoke drew cleanly upward. The flames warmed the room, chasing shadows into the corners. And for the first time since he had signed the deed in Martha Henderson's kitchen, he felt a fragile sense of ownership. He ate the last of the bread he had brought with him, washing it down with water from his canteen, then unrolled his blanket beside the fire. As he lay there, the blueprints beside him glowing faintly in the firelight, he felt a strange mix of fear and wonder. He had come here with nothing but $1 and a body bruised by failure. Now in the silence of the mountain night, he held in his hands the possibility of something far greater. The cabin was not just a shelter, not just a ruin bought with his last coin. It was a mystery, one that had waited nearly a century for someone to return. And though he could not yet know the shape of it, he felt deep in his bones that his life, which he had thought finished, was only beginning again. The fire crackled softly, the creek murmured outside, and he closed his eyes with the weight of the hidden stone heavy on his mind. Somewhere beneath these walls, beneath this mountain, lay secrets that had been buried for nearly 90 years. Secrets that, for reasons he could not yet grasp, had chosen him as their witness. And as sleep finally overtook him, he understood with absolute certainty that he would not turn away from them, no matter where they led. The morning came slowly, with a pale light that crept through the dusty windows of the cabin and spread in cautious streaks across the floorboards. He woke to the sound of the creek outside, steady and patient, and for the first time in many months he did not wake beneath the groan of passing traffic or the coughs of men turning on shelter cots. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, glowing faintly like coals in a blacksmith's forge, and the air was cold enough that his breath lingered before him. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and sat up, blinking at the blueprint still spread across the floor, as though to remind him of the discovery he had made in the night. They looked fragile in the morning light, but their meaning pressed heavily against him. Underground chambers, hidden passages, annotations written in a careful hand, and that single phrase for the children. The words had burned into his mind as deeply as the smoke from the fire had clung to his clothes. He rose stiffly, folded the papers back into the cloth, and placed them carefully into his rucksack, as though they were treasures rather than brittle documents left behind by a man long dead. Then he stepped outside into air so clean and sharp that it stung his lungs. The clearing looked different in the daylight. The moss on the cabin wall shone green, dew sparkled in the meadow grass, and the forest seemed to breathe around him, its shadows deep yet alive. The cabin no longer seemed a ruin waiting to collapse. Instead, it stood like an unfinished story, asking him whether he had the will to continue the writing. The porch creaked beneath his boots as he inspected its sagging boards. Some were soft, rotted nearly through, and he could push a finger into the wood as if it were sponge. The shutters, hanging askew, rattled in the breeze, and one fell loose when he touched it, clattering to the ground with a hollow thud. He frowned, but instead of despair, he felt a stirring of something that had lain dormant in him since the last day he had set foot on a worksite. It was the instinct to repair, to rebuild. His hands remembered the weight of hammers, the cut of saws, the rhythm of labor that turned decay into strength. He spent the day working in small ways, beginning not with grand ambitions, but with the little tasks that could restore order. He cleared the debris from inside splintered furniture too far gone to save, bird nests crumbled into dust, scraps of fabric eaten through by moths. Each piece he carried outside seemed to lighten the cabin's air. The fireplace, once shadowed with grime, revealed carvings on its mantle, faint patterns like waves or vines that had been hidden beneath soot. He polished them with a rag until their curves came alive again, tracing them with a reverence that surprised him. By midday, hunger gnawed at him, but he pressed on, drinking from the creek and chewing the last crust of bread. He pried up loose boards in the floor, finding beneath them coins that had fallen through the cracks decades earlier, buttons dulled with age, and once, to his astonishment, a child's marble, still glassy and bright. He rolled it between his fingers, the tiny swirl inside catching the light, and thought again of the words on the blueprint, for the children. It was not just a phrase, but a presence. The cabin felt shaped by it, haunted not by malice, but by echoes of laughter and voices that had once filled its walls. The work continued until the sun dipped low. He dragged fallen branches to repair the gaps in the porch, using stones to weigh them until he could gather proper nails. He stacked firewood by the door, though his hands were blistered and raw, the skin too long, softened by idleness. With each task, the cabin seemed to breathe easier, its silence shifting from abandonment to expectation. And with each task, he felt his own body reawakening, muscles long starved for purpose, swelling with a dull, welcome ache. That evening, he sat by the fire once more, his rucksack beside him and the marble resting on the mantle. The flames crackled, throwing light against the stones, and his eyes wandered again to the blueprint's hidden chambers. He could not stop thinking about them. Somewhere beneath his feet, passages stretched into the dark, carved by a man whose name still lingered in this valley. What had Samuel Whitmore built here, and why had he hidden it so carefully? He thought of the polished stone he had removed from the fireplace, of the precision with which it had been fitted, and he knew the man had not been building only for comfort. The next days blurred into a rhythm. Each morning he rose with the sun, stepping into the cold grass to wash his face in the creek, then turning to the slow work of restoration. He patched holes in the roof with branches and bark, enough to keep out the rain. He swept years of dust from the loft until the planks shone faintly in the light. He built a crude shelf from fallen wood to hold what few possessions he had. At night he returned to the fire, exhaustion dragging him down but satisfaction keeping him awake. Yet always beneath the labor, the mystery hummed. He found himself wandering the property, tracing the lines of the blueprint in his mind. The meadow stretched wider than he had realized, dotted with wildflowers that swayed like silent witnesses. Near the tree line he discovered the rectangular depression he had glimpsed before, the faint outline of stones sunk into the earth, marking what had once been another foundation. He knelt there, brushing away leaves and uncovered corners of stone fitted with the same precision as the cabin itself. This had been no mere shed. Something larger had stood here once, though the forest had reclaimed it. And then, late one afternoon, he found the well. It sat half-hidden by thickets of raspberry canes, its stone rim covered with lichen. The planks that had once sealed it were warped and sagging, the chicken wire rusted to threads. He leaned over it cautiously, peering into the shaft that descended into darkness. A rope still hung there, newer than the rest, its fibers less weathered, as if someone had replaced it not long ago. His skin prickled. The blueprint's words returned to him like a whisper carried on the wind. "Look for the compass in the well." He stepped back, unsettled, but could not shake the pull of it. Someone had left these clues, hidden these chambers, preserved these plans. Not by accident, not carelessly, but with the intent that someday they would be found. The thought filled him with a strange urgency, as though time were no longer indifferent. His life had been marked for years by drifting days with no meaning. Now meaning pressed on him from every side, insistent, waiting. That night the fire glowed warm, and the cabin seemed less empty. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering like unseen companions. He imagined children sitting in the loft, their voices murmuring lessons, their laughter carried into the meadow. He imagined Samuel Whitmore himself, a man with calloused hands and eyes set on some purpose larger than survival, fitting each stone into place with the same care that had gone into the hidden fireplace block. The cabin had been built as more than shelter. It had been built as sanctuary. Lying on his blanket, listening to the creek's steady murmur and the creak of old beams above, he felt for the first time in years that his life was not simply something to endure. The cabin was not just his refuge. It was his test. Each nail he drove, each board he lifted, each clue he followed seemed to bind him to the story Whitmore had left unfinished. He had come here a broken man, hollowed out by failure and loss, but the cabin, with its secrets and its quiet demands, was beginning to shape him into something else. As the fire died to embers and the night deepened around the clearing, he whispered into the silence as though to the stones themselves, "I'll see it through." And though no voice answered, the cabin seemed to settle, the timbers sighing like an old man content to rest, as if it had been waiting all along for someone to say those words. The days lengthened as he pressed himself into the rhythm of labor. But no matter how sore his body grew from lifting stones, sawing fallen branches into planks, or scrubbing years of dust from surfaces, his mind circled back again and again to the mysteries the cabin contained. He could feel them in the grain of the wood, in the cool permanence of the stones, in the way the air seemed to hum at night when the fire died low. The blueprint remained his constant companion, its brittle paper unfolding fresh questions every time he spread it across the table he had fashioned out of salvaged boards. The words, "for the children," stared back at him like an accusation, like a call to action he did not yet understand. The well had unsettled him most of all. Though he had not yet lowered the rope again, he could not escape the thought of it. Each time he passed the raspberry canes, their branches thorned and heavy with leaves, he felt as though unseen eyes were watching him from the darkness below. The rope swayed faintly when the wind touched it, as if beckoning him to test it, to drop a bucket into the shaft and see what secrets it still held. But something inside urged patience. He was not ready, not yet. Instead, he sought answers in Cedar Ridge, carrying with him the folded blueprint sealed in its cloth wrapping. The library was smaller than he had imagined, tucked into the second floor of a community center that smelled of varnish and old paper. The stairs creaked as though warning him to turn back, but he pressed upward, the papers under his arm a weight both literal and symbolic. Behind the desk sat Martha Henderson, her silver hair gleaming in the light that fell through tall windows, her expression sharpening when she saw what he carried. "I thought you'd find your way here sooner or later," she said, her tone neither surprised nor entirely pleased. "The cabin has a way of dragging its new owners into the past." He spread the papers across a table by the window, using heavy books she fetched from the shelves to weigh down the corners. She bent over them, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the lines of the hidden chambers. Her eyes softened in a way he had not seen before, touched not by suspicion, but by memory. "My father worked those stones," she whispered, her voice breaking the quiet. "Henry Henderson, best stonemason in 3 counties. Samuel wanted the foundation to last forever, and my father gave him that." She glanced at him, eyes sharp again. These plans, he never meant for them to disappear. He meant for them to protect. "Protect who?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. She lifted her gaze toward the windows, as though she could see beyond the street and into decades past. "Children," she said simply. "Orphans, runaways, the broken and the lost. Samuel brought them to the cabin, fed them, taught them, gave them a place where no one could reach them. My mother cooked for them, sent bread up with my father when he went to lay stone. I remember their laughter carrying down into town. I was only a girl then, but I remember." Her voice quavered with the weight of memory, and then she moved to a filing cabinet, returning with a folder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings and photographs. She spread them across the table like relics of another life. Grainy black and white images showed children in patched clothes but smiling, standing in front of the very cabin he now called home. In some, Samuel himself appeared, a tall figure with steady eyes, his hands rough and strong, always placed protectively on a child's shoulder or guiding them in their work. The man stared at the images, a heaviness settling in his chest. He could almost hear their voices echoing through his cabin, see their small hands tracing the same beams he had polished, their eyes full of the trust he himself had forgotten how to give. These were not ghosts of malice, but of hope, and yet the silence of the cabin seemed to echo louder now that he knew who had once filled it. Martha produced one final artifact, a leather-bound journal, its clasp tarnished but intact. "This was returned to my father after Samuel disappeared," she said. "He never read it, couldn't bring himself to, but maybe you should." She placed it in his hands and he felt the pulse of history beneath his fingertips. Back at the cabin, with the journal open before the fire, he read the words of a man who had believed in something far greater than himself. Samuel wrote of the children, of Mary who woke crying but learned to smile by the creek, of Tommy whose first laugh in months had come when he discovered fish darting in the water. He wrote of building the underground chambers not as curiosities, but as sanctuaries, places to hide if ever danger came. And then the tone shifted, the warmth of his entries shadowed by fear. 2 men had visited, claiming to be officials, but their questions had been too sharp, their presence too lingering. He wrote of accelerating work on a sanctuary chamber and of the need for secrecy. The journal ended abruptly in March of 1938. The words hurried, the lines uneven. "They are close now. The children are frightened. If I do not return, may this place guard them as I intended. Look for the compass in the well. It will lead you where you must go." The man sat frozen long after the fire had burned to embers, the journal heavy in his lap. The story of Samuel Whitmore was no longer a vague shadow, but a life, a purpose carved into stone and paper, entrusted to whoever came after. He thought of Martha's weary eyes, of the photographs of children who had once been safe within these walls, and of his own fractured life that had led him here. The cabin had chosen him as surely as he had chosen it. The next morning he stood at the well again, the rope swaying gently in the breeze. His hands gripped it, calluses splitting as he prepared to lower the bucket into darkness. Whatever lay at the bottom would not be treasure in the ordinary sense, he knew. It would be responsibility, weighty and unshakable. As the bucket descended, the rope sliding through his hands, he felt his heart pounding in rhythm with each foot of depth. When it struck something solid, he drew it up slowly, the rope straining, until at last it emerged into the sunlight. Inside the dripping bucket was a bundle wrapped in oiled leather, tied with string that gave way at his touch. He peeled the leather back, revealing a brass compass still gleaming faintly despite the years. Its needle pointed true, steady as if waiting for him. But there was more. Rolled around it like a sheath was a map, its heavy paper still intact, its ink faded but legible. Directions, landmarks, pacing instructions, all drawn with the same precise hand he had seen in the blueprints. The man sank to his knees in the grass, the compass heavy in his palm, the map trembling in his other hand. Around him the forest whispered, the creek murmured, and the cabin watched in silence. The past had reached through nearly 90 years to place this secret in his keeping. He knew then that his journey had only just begun, and that Samuel's legacy was no longer buried. It was alive, and it demanded to be followed. The morning after he hauled the compass and map from the well, the air carried a crispness that felt different, sharper somehow, as though the mountains themselves expected him to move. He barely slept through the night, his mind running in restless circles around the map's faded lines and the steady pull of the compass needle. The fire had died long before dawn, but he did not bother to rekindle it. Instead, he sat hunched over the table he had cobbled together, studying the instructions again and again, until the paper threatened to crumble under his touch. The map was simple, yet purposeful. Landmarks he recognized from his brief explorations of the property were etched with deliberate strokes. The bend of the creek, the flat boulder in the meadow, the grove of aspens whispering in the wind. Between them were numbers, paces, directions, all leading from one to the next like a trail meant to be followed not by chance, but by faith. Whoever Samuel Whitmore had written this for, he had trusted that they would one day stand where he stood now, compass in hand, willing to follow its pull. By mid-morning, he was ready. He filled his canteen from the creek, tucked the map carefully into his rucksack, and looped the compass on its chain around his neck. The weight of it settled against his chest with unexpected finality, as though the man who had vanished almost a century earlier had passed him a burden, both precious and perilous. With each step away from the cabin, he felt less like a drifter stumbling into chance, and more like a man being led towards something that had waited too long in silence. The forest received him with its usual mix of quiet and whispers, but he noticed details now that he had overlooked before. The lightning-struck pine stood like a sentinel, its splintered trunk silvered with age, just as the map indicated. He counted his paces aloud, measuring each stride with care. 47 steps northeast brought him directly to its base. He laid his hand on the scarred wood, the surface rough beneath his fingers, and felt a tremor of awe. Samuel's instructions had been precise, and after nearly 9 decades, they still held true. From the pine, the compass guided him north. He moved through a grove of aspens, their pale trunks shifting in the breeze like a gathering of ghosts. The leaves rattled above him, whispering secrets he could not catch. And then the granite boulder appeared ahead, immense and flat, as if the mountain itself had placed it there for some long-forgotten purpose. He climbed onto its surface, pausing to look back toward the cabin. It stood small in the distance, half hidden by trees, its roof sagging, its walls dark against the bright meadow. And yet from here, with the compass gleaming against his chest, it seemed more significant than any house or shelter he had ever known. The next measure led him northwest, 15 steps to a stone half buried under needles and earth. He knelt, brushing aside the forest blanket until the carved marker revealed itself. A slab of granite no larger than a loaf of bread, its surface etched with faint symbols that shimmered faintly in the light. A small circular hole had been carved into one side, precise and intentional. He knew without hesitation what belonged there. The compass slid into the hole with a soft click, and for a moment nothing happened. Then with a grinding sigh, the stone shifted beneath his hands. He pulled it free, his breath catching as the earth beneath revealed not roots or rock, but the corner of a brass box, its edges corroded by time but unmistakably crafted by human hands. Heart pounding, he worked it loose, the soil giving way reluctantly, until at last he held the box in his lap. It was heavier than he expected, its lid secured with hinges that protested when he pried them open. Inside lay bundles wrapped in oiled cloth, perfectly preserved despite their years underground. He unwrapped the first, and photographs spilled into his hands, black and white images of children he recognized from Martha's folder at the library, though these were more candid. A boy grinning as he hoisted a bucket of water from the creek, two girls braiding each other's hair by the fire, a cluster of children building something that looked like a garden fence. Their joy was etched in each frame, and he felt the distance of decades collapse as though their voices might rise at any moment from the clearing around him. Beneath the photographs lay letters, written in uneven hands on scraps of brown paper. He unfolded one carefully, the ink faded but still legible. "Dear Mr. Samuel," it began, "thank you for keeping us safe. Before I came here, I thought no one would care if I lived or died. Now I know family is not just who you are born to, but who chooses you." It was signed by a girl named Margaret, age 14. He set it down with trembling fingers, unable to stop the sting in his eyes. The second bundle revealed documents of a different nature, legal papers transferring ownership of the cabin and its land to something called the Children's Mountain Trust. The date was March 15, 1938, mere days before Samuel's disappearance. He read the lines with disbelief. Samuel had not built the cabin for himself, nor had he left it behind as a monument. He had legally bound it to serve as sanctuary, forever, for those who needed it most. At the very bottom of the box was a sealed envelope, the paper brittle with age but the ink bold across the front, for the new guardians. His pulse quickened as he tore it open, revealing a letter written in Samuel's steady hand. "To those who find this place," it began, "know that you are more than owners of land or keepers of stone. You are guardians of a promise. The children who lived here carried scars no eye could see. Yet in these mountains, they learned to trust, to laugh, to heal. I cannot protect them forever, but I can ensure that this sanctuary will endure. I have hidden more than memories in these woods. You will find inventions, knowledge, and the means to help not only those within these walls, but children across the world. Use them wisely. And remember, the greatest treasure is not gold or silver, but the hope you carry forward." The man sat there for what felt like hours, the letter trembling in his hands, the words echoing through him. Guardian. The word rang like a bell in his chest. He had come to these mountains broken, a man who had lost everything but a crumpled dollar and the will to survive one more day. Now Samuel Whitmore was asking him to carry something far heavier than his own survival. He was asking him to carry hope. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had sunk behind the peaks, painting the sky in deep streaks of violet and crimson. He carried the box in both arms, clutching it as though it might vanish if he loosened his grip. Inside, he spread its contents across the floor by the fire, laying out the photographs, letters, and documents until the room was alive with echoes of the past. The children's faces glowed in the flickering light, their laughter silent but almost audible. He traced the lines of Samuel's letter again and again, his mind spinning with questions he could not yet answer. What inventions had Samuel hidden? What dangers had driven him to such secrecy? And what role could a man like him, broken and penniless, play in carrying forward a legacy so vast? Sleep came reluctantly that night. When it did, it was filled with dreams of children's voices calling from beneath the earth, of passages winding deeper into the mountain, of water flowing clean and endless from hidden springs. He woke before dawn, the compass still resting on the mantle, its needle steady as though it pointed not only north, but into the heart of his future. He knew he could not turn away now. The map had guided him to this first secret, but it was only the beginning. The forest still held more. The blueprints whispered of chambers yet to be found, and Samuel's words pressed against his mind with relentless clarity. The greatest treasure is not what you find, but what you choose to do with it. He rose, banked the fire, and prepared to follow the compass wherever it led. The cabin no longer felt like a ruin, nor even a refuge. It felt like the threshold of something vast, something dangerous, and something necessary. He had been chosen by accident, perhaps, but chosen nonetheless. And as the first light of day spilled over the peaks, he understood that the path of the compass would lead him deeper into Samuel's legacy and deeper into the man he was meant to become. The dawn after the discovery of the brass box was unlike any other he had known in the mountains. The air was brittle with cold, the light sharp against the ridges, and yet within him there pulsed a warmth that no fire had kindled. He had laid the photographs, the letters, and the trust deed carefully across the table before sleep finally claimed him. But when he rose in the gray morning, they were the first things his eyes sought. The faces of the children stared back at him from decades past, their laughter frozen in images, yet somehow alive in the room, as though the walls themselves carried echoes of their voices. He lingered over the letters Samuel Whitmore had left for the new guardians. The words did not diminish with repeated reading. They grew heavier, each sentence deepening the sense that the cabin was no longer only his refuge, but his charge. He made himself coffee from water boiled over the fire, sipping it slowly as the sun spread across the clearing. His gaze drifted to the compass resting on the mantle, its needle unwavering, its presence constant. The map, with its lines already fulfilled, no longer seemed to be the end of a journey, but the beginning. The blueprints still showed chambers underground, hidden places that remained unexplored, and Samuel's journal had spoken of an invention, a gift meant for children, not only of the mountains, but of the world. He felt as though he stood not in a cabin in the wilderness, but on the threshold of a story unfinished, one whose final chapters had been entrusted to hands not yet ready, but unwilling to let go. The weight of the responsibility pressed on him more than the weight of poverty ever had. When he had lived on the streets, hunger and cold were enemies to endure, nothing more. Now he faced the weight of history, of legacy, of a man who had given his life for a cause that corporations and governments had tried to bury. He felt himself faltering beneath it until his eyes returned to the photographs, to the girl braiding another's hair, to the boy smiling by the creek, to the handwritten letters thanking Samuel for safety. It was there, in their faces and words, that he found steadiness. This was not about him. It was about carrying forward what had already been proven possible, that broken lives could be mended when given a sanctuary and a chance. He spent days afterward in patient exploration of the cabin and its land. He returned to the foundation ruins in the forest, where Samuel had once built his schoolhouse, and searched more carefully this time, sweeping away years of needles and soil. In the center, he found a circle of stones arranged too precisely to be natural. When he shifted them aside, he uncovered a narrow chamber lined with the same expert stonework as the cabin. Inside lay a cache of books wrapped in oiled cloth, still intact, the words within preserved. Textbooks, journals, instruction manuals, all bearing Samuel's meticulous notes. This was not simply shelter. It was a library, a school, a hidden university for children who had once been forgotten. Among the volumes he discovered sketches of a device, its parts labeled, its purpose hinted at. Samuel had called it a purification system, an invention to turn even the dirtiest water into something safe to drink. The designs were brilliant in their simplicity, relying not on rare metals or electricity, but on pressure, sand, stone, and a mechanism any pair of careful hands could maintain. Alongside the sketches were fragments of correspondence, letters from organizations beyond Colorado, some humanitarian in nature, others more sinister, pressing Samuel for rights, for patents, for ownership. He had resisted them, refusing to sell what he believed belonged to all. The discovery filled him with awe and dread in equal measure. Awe for the brilliance of a man who had created something that could save countless lives. Dread for the enemies that such an invention would have drawn. The half-burned notes, the hurried entries in Samuel's journal, the abrupt disappearance, all of it pointed to a truth he could no longer deny. Samuel had been silenced, not by accident or misfortune, but by design. He had chosen the children over profit, and he had paid for it with his life. At night, the man sat before the fire with the compass in his palm, feeling its cool weight. He understood now why Samuel had left such elaborate instructions, why he had hidden his work beneath stone and soil. This was not only treasure, but temptation. In the wrong hands, the invention would have become a weapon of profit and control. In the right hands, it could be salvation. And Samuel somehow had trusted that the right hands would find it. It struck him then with a force that nearly bent him double. He, a broken man with nothing but the clothes on his back, was now those hands. Not because he had earned it, not because he was worthy, but because he had stumbled into a cabin that no one else wanted and had been willing to look deeper when others would have turned away. The irony both humbled and terrified him. Days turned into weeks as he rebuilt the cabin with new resolve. He patched the roof with care, repaired the porch with salvaged timber, cleared the windows to let in the full wash of mountain light. Yet even as the cabin grew stronger, it seemed a whisper of greater purpose. He could not shake the vision of children's laughter filling the rooms once more, of the cabin becoming sanctuary again. He imagined beds in the loft, books spread across the table, voices reciting lessons by the fire. He imagined not solitude but community, not survival but renewal. But the practical challenges loomed as large as the dream. He had no money, no influence, no means to build a foundation or manufacture an invention that corporations had killed to suppress. His only tools were his hands, his determination, and the fragile inheritance of paper, brass, and stone that Samuel had left behind. Yet perhaps that was enough. The invention itself was proof. The letters were testimony, the compass and documents evidence of a crime that had silenced a man, but not his vision. One evening, as he spread the blueprints, letters, and photographs across the floor, he realized the cabin was no longer empty. Though no children slept in the loft, though no voices rang in its walls, the weight of Samuel's hope filled every corner. It was as if the man had never truly left, as if his spirit lingered, urging the work forward. He thought of Martha Henderson, of her watchful eyes and careful words, of the way she had given him Samuel's journal without hesitation. She had known all along what the cabin was meant to be. She had been waiting for someone to take up the mantle. The choice lay before him as clearly as if Samuel himself stood in the firelight, asking. He could sell the land, abandon the cabin, let the forest reclaim the stones until nothing remained but rumor. Or he could remain, shoulder the burden, and begin the impossible task of restoring not just the walls, but the mission that had built them. As the flames dwindled to embers, he reached for the compass, held it against his chest, and closed his eyes. He had lived long enough with nothing to lose. Now at last he had something to give. He would stay. He would rebuild. He would carry the legacy forward, not as an owner, but as a guardian. Outside, the creek murmured, the forest whispered, and the mountains stood eternal. The cabin, scarred but unbroken, seemed to lean closer, as though it too had heard his decision. And in that moment, for the first time since his fall into despair, he felt not like a man merely surviving, but like one who had been chosen for a purpose. The inheritance was not wealth, nor comfort, nor security. It was hope, and hope was heavier than stone. But it was also the only thing worth carrying. If this story gave you chills, don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button now, turn on the bell, and be the first to see tomorrow's unbelievable story. Keep watching our other videos for more hidden secrets that will leave you speechless, and share this one with your friends. Let them be part of the mystery too.